Hey everyone, Noah Zerby here. In this video series, we're going to look at the United Nations system. This video focuses in particular on the historical roots of the United Nations, as well as on the United Nations Charter. In later videos, we'll look at the structure and functions of the United Nations, as well as some contemporary issues before the UN. So let's get started. But before we get into the United Nations itself, let's start with a couple basic concepts in international relations. Scholars of IR usually distinguish between bilateral and multilateral diplomacy. It's also useful to think about why a country might choose one path over the other. Put simply, bilateral diplomacy is conducted directly between two countries. When the United States and China negotiate a new trade deal, that's bilateral diplomacy. When North and South Korea discuss an arms control arrangement, that's also bilateral diplomacy. Multilateral diplomacy, by contrast, involves multiple states at the same time and usually takes place through specific international organizations or forums. Meetings of the Group of Seven, the G7, the African Union, NATO, or the United Nations are all examples of multilateral diplomacy. But why might a state favor bilateral or multilateral diplomacy over the other? What, in other words, are the advantages and disadvantages of each approach? Usually, bilateral diplomacy is considered easier because there are fewer actors, two as opposed to many, with fewer competing agendas. As a result, the probability of concluding an agreement is generally higher. Multilateral diplomacy is more difficult because of the larger number of actors and interests involved. But multilateral agreements are better able to set global or regional standards and consequently usually have a bigger impact on the global stage when they're successfully concluded. More powerful states will often favor bilateral negotiations because it allows them to use their disproportionate power over the other party to force an agreement. When the US negotiates a bilateral arrangement with Honduras, or when China negotiates with Zambia, the larger power can use their economic, political, and even military leverage to put pressure on smaller powers to agree to terms that may be less favorable to them. By contrast, middle powers like Canada or the Nordic countries often prefer multilateral negotiations because it permits them to play a more active role in negotiations and creates the possibility for trade-offs between issue areas. Multilateral diplomacy necessitates intermediaries capable of uniting regional, ideological, or other blocs and bringing them to negotiate with competing powers. Middle powers excel at this role and are thus often active players in multilateral diplomacy. Intergovernmental organizations, or IGOs, are just that. Organizations comprised of governments, sometimes referred to as member states or contracting parties. They often have a diverse set of agendas, specific or narrow mandates. They can also have broad international membership or be more regionally focused. Based on these differences, we can think about three different types of intergovernmental organizations. First, we have global general-purpose IGOs. These are international organizations with broad mandates that deal with a diversity of issues and questions at the global level. The United Nations, which we'll look at in just a moment, is an example of such an organization. Second, we have regional IGOs. These are general organizations with broad mandates to deal with a diversity of issues and questions, but primarily at a regional level. Organizations such as the European Union, which we'll look at in a few weeks, or the African Union, or the Organization of American States are all examples of general regional IGOs. Finally, we have functional IGOs, which generally have a narrow mandate to deal with a specific issue or question. Examples here might include the Organization of Petroleum Exporting Countries, OPEC, which seeks to manage the global oil supply by coordinating production output among its members, or the Universal Postal Union, which facilitates the global exchange of mail. Let's turn now to look at the United Nations in particular. As mentioned previously, the United Nations is the leading global intergovernmental organization in the world today, with 193 member states. It has a general mandate that encompasses a broad array of issues ranging from international peace and security to development to human rights. To accomplish its broad mandate, it is comprised of various specialized agencies and numerous subsidiary organizations. We'll return to these in a later video. But for now, let's consider where the United Nations came from, where did it originate, and how did we get to where we are today. To understand the United Nations system, we first have to step back and consider its precursor organization, the League of Nations. Established by the Peace of Versailles that officially ended World War I, the League was very much a reaction to that war. World War I was commonly referred to as the Great War, or the war to end all wars at the time. Remember, World War II was not a foregone conclusion yet. From the outbreak of hostilities in July 1914 to the conclusion of the conflict in November of 1918, the war had a devastating impact on the population and economies of Europe. More than 16 million people, about half of whom were civilians, were killed in the conflict. The war also saw the first widespread application of industrial technology to military conflict and shepherded in a wide range of political changes, including the Communist Revolution in Russia in 1917 and the imposition of a punitive treaty, the Peace of Versailles, which created the conditions for the rise of Hitler in Germany. But in the immediate aftermath of World War I, few would have predicted that there would be another conflict, World War II. Instead, the world was focused on how to prevent the rise of another conflict. To that end, President Woodrow Wilson articulated a series of propositions intended to prevent another war in a speech to Congress on July 8, 1918. These 14 points articulated a liberal institutionalist vision of the international order that would, in Wilson's opinion, set the stage for a stable system of international cooperation to prevent future conflict. In President Wilson's view, these 14 points laid the foundation for a just and secure peace and not just for a new balance of power system. The most important of these points, all at the heart of liberal institutional theory, were Point 1, which emphasized the need for open and transparent international diplomacy to avoid the secret backroom deals and alliances that cascaded into World War I. Point 2, which argued for freedom of navigation, and Point 3, which advocated for the removal of trade barriers in order to facilitate closer economic ties and interconnections between states. Point 4, which called for the widespread disarmament and limits on the expansion of militaries in order to prevent the kind of military escalation seen during the war. Point 5, which called for an adjustment of colonial claims and the extension of sovereignty to the colonies, and the articulation of the principle of national self-determination, that is, that nations are generally entitled to statehood. Points 6 through 13 dealt with a specific distribution and reallocation of territory necessitated by World War I. They called, for example, for the creation of an independent Polish state with access to the sea, the readjustment of Russian, Italian, French territories affected by the war, and so on. And finally, in Point 14, Wilson calls for the formation of a new international organization, the League of Nations, in order to provide a vehicle for both open diplomacy and collective security. In many ways, the League was ahead of its time. It shifted thinking on international security, brought humanitarian concerns squarely into the focus of the international level, and facilitated technical cooperation between states. It marked the first effort to truly institutionalize international cooperation between states at the global level. At the same time, the League was a highly imperfect organization and suffered from many shortcomings that ultimately led to its demise. First, membership in the League of Nations was incomplete and regularly shifting. The United States, which had been one of the primary advocates for the League and was clearly one of the leading powers in the world, never joined the League after the U.S. Senate rejected the treaty. Germany and Japan withdrew from the League when it expressed opposition to their expansion. The Soviet Union was expelled after invading Finland, and at its peak, the League had only 58 members, the vast majority of which were European states. Second, the League's disarmament mandate quickly ran into opposition from member states, who were concerned that if they disarmed, they would be vulnerable to attack. Despite hosting several disarmament conferences, the League was never able to secure disarmament or prevent military buildups in Germany, Italy, Spain, and Japan. Third, the League's requirement for unanimity effectively paralyzed decision-making within the organization, and even when it could arrive at decisions, the process was slow and cumbersome. And finally, the collective security mechanism envisioned when the League was formed was never as effective as its proponents believed it would be. While the League enjoyed some early successes, for example in resolving the Åland crisis between Sweden and Finland in 1921, it failed to successfully address several crises that had more significant actors. In 1931, Japan invaded the province of Manchuria. They occupied the territory, ultimately establishing a puppet regime to govern it. The League attempted to negotiate a peaceful settlement, but its members were unwilling to commit their own military forces to repel the Japanese occupation of China, as the principle of collective security would demand. Instead, the League issued a report in 1933 condemning the Japanese occupation but taking no other action. Japan responded by withdrawing from the League but occupied Manchuria through the end of World War II. Similarly, in 1935, Italy invaded Abyssinia, now Ethiopia, using a variety of chemical weapons including mustard gas and poisoning water supplies as part of their attack. The League condemned Italy's aggressive actions and voted to impose limited economic sanctions on the country, stopping short of prohibiting the sale of oil, largely as a result of British opposition to stronger action. The failure of the League to take more decisive action was rooted in areas which collectively led to the failure of the collective security mechanism. First, the League appeared to have little interest in conflicts outside of Europe, at least in any substantive manner. Second, members of the League appeared unwilling to use their own forces to deter aggression when not in their immediate national interest. Indeed, as was the case in the Italy-Abyssinia case, they appeared hesitant to take any action whatsoever. As a result, the threat that collective security relied on, that a breach of international peace would be met by a collective and overwhelming response by the international community, never materialized. Aggressors were quick to realize this. In 1937, Japan launched an invasion of China. In 1939, Germany invaded Czechoslovakia, marking the official start of World War II. The League, which had been founded on the goal of preventing another global war, had truly failed. At its meeting on December 14, 1939, the League Assembly voted to grant the Secretary General the power and legal authority to allow the League of Nations to continue to exist, though the organization itself was not meeting. Its final official meeting was on April 18, 1946, when delegates from the remaining 34 member states voted to liquidate the League and transfer its remaining funds, properties, and responsibilities to the new United Nations. If the foundations for the United Nations were laid by the League of Nations, the specific origins of the UN lie in World War II. The term United Nations was first used in 1942 and was commonly used during the war as a euphemism for the Allied powers led by the United States, the United Kingdom, and the Soviet Union. The term itself can be found in the 1942 Declaration of United Nations, a successor statement to the Atlantic Charter. The Atlantic Charter was jointly issued by the United States and the United Kingdom in 1941 and outlined the Allies' goals for World War II. Specifically, the Atlantic Charter committed its signatories to a post-war settlement that rejected territorial aggrandizement from the war, declined to implement territorial changes made against popular wishes of the people, more commonly referred to as the principle of national self-determination, to restore the governments overthrown by the war, a reduction in trade barriers, and to global cooperation to improve the economic and social conditions for all, and to secure freedom from fear and want, as well as the abandonment of the use of force and disarmament of aggressor nations. The Declaration of the United Nations, signed a year later, reaffirmed the Atlantic Charter while simultaneously expanding the Charter's scope and participation. Co-authored by the British Prime Minister Winston Churchill and U.S. President Franklin Roosevelt, the Declaration was officially signed by 26 states when issued on January 1, 1942. By the end of the war, some 47 countries had become signatories to the Declaration. In addition to the principles of the Atlantic Charter, which were explicitly reaffirmed by the Declaration, the Declaration of United Nations specifically outlined that the Allies, or United Nations, would not accept anything less than complete victory, operationalized as the unconditional surrender of the Axis powers. They also prohibited the minor Axis powers like Romania, Bulgaria, Finland, and Italy from joining after they abandoned the Axis during the war. The signatories pledged not to pursue a separate peace treaty and to cooperate with one another in waging of the war. The Declaration reaffirmed the principles of life, liberty, independence, protection of human rights, and the pursuit of justice found in the Atlantic Charter. Interestingly, it added religious freedom as a key component of the agreement despite objections by Soviet Premier Joseph Stalin. Perhaps more importantly, the declaration became the foundation for negotiations to establish the United Nations as an institution after the conclusion of the war. As World War II began to draw to a close, the Allied powers were increasingly interested in thinking about the post-war architecture of the international system. In October 1943, the Big Four, the United States, the Soviet Union, the United Kingdom, and China, met in Moscow to begin discussions of the post-war international order. Remember, at this time, the war had begun to shift. While the outcome of the war was far from a foregone conclusion, the Allies had good reason for optimism. German advances into the USSR had stalled in the previous winter, and for the first time during the war, the Allied powers appeared to be making headway against German and Japanese positions. Anti-submarine operations in the North Atlantic helped reduce the threat of U-boat attack, increasing the flow of supplies from the United States to Europe. And in the Pacific theater, the U.S. was making slow but steady progress in dislodging Japanese forces from the various islands in the region. While it would still be another 8 months before D-Day and almost 2 years before the war would be concluded, thinking about the post-war international order had already begun. Against the backdrop of shifting fortunes in the war, the Allied powers began planning for the post-war order. The first meeting took place in October 1943 in Moscow. At the Moscow conference, the Allied powers issued the Four Powers Declaration, jointly signed by the US, UK, USSR, and China. The declaration explicitly rejected regional councils, which had been favored by Churchill, in favor of a global organization after the war. The specific contours of that organization were purposely left vague for fear of being unable to reach consensus positions. Instead, the Big Four committed themselves to the creation, at the earliest possible date, of a general international organization. The Dumbarton Oaks Conference, held in Washington, D.C. in August and September of 1944, was intended to be a follow-on conference to develop the specific contours of the international organization conceptualized by the Four Powers Declaration a year earlier. While the USSR refused to meet directly with Chinese delegations, American and British diplomats were able to meet separately with each delegation, and in the end, all parties agreed to a general set of principles. Indeed, the Dumbarton Oaks Conference resolved most of the major disputes around the structure and function of the successor organization for the League of Nations. Specifically, the Big Four agreed that the new organization would have four primary purposes. First, the maintenance of international peace and security, and to that end, the ability to take collective measures to prevent and remove threats to peace. 2. The development of friendly relations among nations through appropriate measures to strengthen universal peace. 3. The promotion of international cooperation in the solution of international economic, social, and humanitarian problems. And 4. The harmonization of actions by nations to achieve these ends. In addition to the general purposes of the organization, the Dumbarton Oaks Conference also resolved major questions around the structure, membership, and voting procedures of the organization. 4 key questions were left unresolved at Dumbarton Oaks. These were addressed at the Yalta Conference in February 1945. Arguably the most well-known of the World War II meetings, Yalta addressed a host of issues related to the post-war settlement, including the division of Germany, the status of Poland, and other questions. For the purposes of the evolution of the United Nations, 2 key questions were resolved at Yalta. First, it was agreed that the permanent members of the Security Council would have a veto power, allowing them to block actions by the organization. For the Soviet Union, this point was a precondition for joining the UN, which they believed would be strongly biased in favor of U.S. interests. Second, the question of membership for the 16 of the Soviet Socialist republics that comprised the USSR was resolved. The USSR had pushed for full membership for all 16 Soviet republics, and Roosevelt countered that all 50 states in the U.S. should also receive membership. By the end, the U.S. and the USSR agreed to extend membership to Ukraine and Belarus, while not for the remaining 14 SSRs. While Roosevelt had retained the right to secure 2 additional votes for the United States, the U.S. never pursued this course of action. By the time the war reached its conclusion, the purpose, institutional shape, and structure of the organization had largely been determined. Nevertheless, a conference of 50 Allied nations was held in April and June 1945 in San Francisco. The United Nations Conference on International Organization. At this conference, the UN Charter was formally negotiated and signed, resulting in the formal creation of the organization itself. While the scope of the organization was largely predetermined, the conference was not without controversy. Argentina and Denmark, which had been allies of Germany during the war, were invited to participate, angering the Soviet delegation, which had opposed their membership in the organization. Conversely, several Latin American countries opposed the extension of membership to Belarus and Ukraine. The status of Poland was also disputed, as the US and USSR could not agree on which government should represent Poland. At the conference, the debate over the scope of the P5's veto power also proved to be a sticking point. However, after extensive debate, the Charter of the UN was approved, largely echoing the agreement struck by the Big Four during the war. Chapter 1, Article 1 of the UN Charter lays out the purposes of the organization. Specifically, it states that the purpose of the United Nations are 1. To maintain international peace and security through collective measures, and to maintain conformity with the principles of justice and international law. 2. To develop friendly relations among states based on the principle of equal rights of self-determination of peoples. 3. To achieve international cooperation to address economic, social, cultural, and humanitarian problems, and to promote respect for human rights and for fundamental freedoms. And 4. To be a center for harmonizing the actions of nations in pursuit of these aims. The Charter of the United Nations also outlines the key principles on which the United Nations was founded. The most important of these are found in Chapter 1 of the UN Charter, specifically Chapter 1, Article 2, Section 1, which provides that the organization is based on the sovereign equality of its members. What do we mean by sovereign equality of states? Clearly, this does not mean that all states are equal. Countries like Malawi or the Central African Republic do not have the economic prowess of China, the military power of the United States, the population of India, or the international clout of countries like Canada or Sweden. Rather, it means that all states possess the same legal rights as every other state. In the United Nations General Assembly, this is operationalized under the principle of one state, one vote. Chapter 2, Article 2, Section 4 provides that all members shall refrain in their international relations from the threat or use of force against the territorial integrity or political independence of any state, or in any other manner inconsistent with the purposes of the United Nations. The principle that states should commit themselves to the peaceful resolution of international disputes has a deep history in international law and can be traced back to the First Hague Peace Conference in 1899. In the context of the United Nations, Chapter 6 of the Charter, which authorizes the UN Security Council to take action to address violations of international peace and security, outlines a wide variety of tools, short of the use of force, available to member states. These include negotiation, inquiry, mediation, conciliation, arbitration, judicial settlements, or resort to international or regional organizations. Under the terms of the Charter, should such actions fail to resolve the dispute, member states are supposed to refer the matter to the Security Council. Of course, in practice, states can and often do use force unilaterally outside of the UN framework. However, the rules and norms created by the United Nations system mitigates against doing so without considerable thought of potential consequences. In 2003, for example, the United States decided to attack Iraq and remove Saddam Hussein from power, despite failing to be able to convince the UN Security Council to authorize such action. From the perspective of American policymakers, the national interest in doing so outweighed the potential costs. However, this action was not undertaken lightly, and in other circumstances, for example, with respect to North Korea, Afghanistan, and Syria, the United States has chosen to wait for Security Council approval before taking military action. Finally, Chapter 1, Article 2, Section 7 provides that nothing contained in the present Charter shall authorize the United Nations to intervene in matters which are essentially within the domestic jurisdiction of any state, or shall require the members to submit such matters to settlement under the present Charter. This is usually referred to as the principle of domestic non-intervention, and has perhaps been one of the most problematic of the core principles on which the United Nations is based. In its simplest formation, this means that no state or international organization can interfere in the domestic affairs of another state, as doing so would violate that state's sovereignty. The principle has traditionally been upheld fervently, particularly by post-colonial states, who view it as an important line of defense against foreign intervention by more powerful states. Interestingly, The strongest defenders of the principle are often those states with the most limited or weakest level of sovereignty in the practical sense. In this sense, domestic non-intervention can be seen as a defense of juridical sovereignty, which becomes more important when real on-the-ground sovereignty is weak or underdeveloped. In invoking the principle of domestic non-intervention, states are asserting their legal right of sovereignty as states. However, the right has never been particularly well defined, and what constitutes a purely domestic matter can be debated. Throughout the 1980s, the General Assembly regularly passed an annual resolution condemning the apartheid system in South Africa. The UN claimed that the system of apartheid had regional and global political impact and therefore fell under the jurisdiction of the United Nations. For its part, South Africa regularly asserted that its domestic political structure, apartheid, was a purely internal or domestic matter and therefore not subject to adjudication or review by the UN. More recently, the interpretation of domestic non-intervention has gradually narrowed as the idea of what constitutes a threat to peace and security has expanded. Of particular interest for our purposes is the fact that human rights violations have increasingly been viewed as matters of international importance, even when these violations are confined to the borders of a specific state. This is most clearly embodied in the responsibility to protect, or R2P, which we'll return to in a later lecture. But the principle itself, that human rights violations are matters of international importance and that states cannot claim domestic non-intervention to shield themselves from scrutiny or punishment for violating them, has become entrenched, particularly since the end of the Cold War. Other chapters of the UN Charter outline the structure and function of the organization. Chapter 2 provides criteria for membership, limiting membership in the organization to peace-loving states who, in the judgment of the organization, are able and willing to carry out charter obligations. It also outlines the process by which states can become members of the United Nations. That process requires, first, approval by the Security Council. This is a substantive vote, so the veto power of the P5 applies. Once recommended by the Council, the General Assembly votes to grant membership. In theory, members can also be expelled from the organization using the same method, though none to date have been. Membership in the United Nations is a particularly important indicator of sovereignty and legitimacy, particularly for small states or states with limited real sovereignty. Originally, there were 51 members, disproportionately from Europe and Latin America. As former colonial states gained their independence, membership in the United Nations expanded. Today, there are 193 member states, the most recent of which is South Sudan, which joined the organization in 2011. Chapters 3 through 15 of the Charter outline the institutional structure of the UN. It's specifying its various bodies, agencies, and outlining their respective powers. We'll look at some of these in a little while. Chapter 16 describes the institutional arrangements for integrating the United Nations with established international law. More specifically, Chapter 16 prohibits secret treaties, specifies that the UN Charter is supreme over any other treaty obligations, and provides for the legal immunity of UN officials. Finally, Chapter 18 outlines the process by which the Charter would be amended, and Chapter 19 describes the process by which the Charter would be approved. The amendment process outlined in Chapter 18 is roughly analogous to the process of amending the U.S. Constitution. Amendments can be proposed via a convention of member states, but this has never been done. Instead, the second avenue for proposals, introduction by a member state through the General Assembly, has been the exclusive path used to date. Once introduced, approval and adoption of the proposed amendment requires a 2/3 majority vote of the General Assembly, and ratification by a 2/3 vote of the member states of the United Nations. Despite the vote occurring in the General Assembly, the permanent members of the Security Council explicitly retain their veto for this vote, giving them the power to stop any proposed changes. To date, only 5 amendments to the UN Charter have been approved, a testament to the difficulty of the process. These amendments were, in 1965, a proposal to increase the size of the Security Council from 11 to 15 members, and the supermajority threshold to take action from 7 to 9 affirmative votes. Second, also in 1965, the size of the Economic and Social Council, or ECOSOC, was increased from 18 to 27 members. Third, in 1968, Article 109 was amended to require a supermajority or a 9/15 vote of the Security Council members and a 2/3 majority vote of the General Assembly to propose a convention to amend the UN Charter. And fourth, in 1973, the size of ECOSOC was again increased, this time from 27 to its current 54 members. Chapter 19 outlined the process by which the UN Charter itself would come into force. In an interesting nod to the failure of the League of Nations, and specifically the absence of the United States from that organization, the UN Charter would only come into force after a majority of signatories of the Charter, including all of the P5, ratified the treaty. That threshold was reached on October 24, 1945, less than 4 months after the San Francisco Conference concluded. So that concludes our introduction to the UN Charter and the history of the UN system. Be sure to check out the other videos on this channel for more UN goodness. Thanks everyone. Bye.